All right, we come to the end of Genesis. We're going to be looking at chapters 49 and 50. And so just since it's this last time, I do want to kind of remind us that we've entitled the whole book Dawn. And that's just because it speaks to the fact that we've seen the dawn or the beginning of really much about anything we know as human beings as far as life and people and so on. We through the book of Genesis, we've seen the dawn of time, the dawn of creation. We've seen the dawn of sin, its consequences, all types of sin, the sin of man, all kinds of sin of mankind, murder, rape, deceit, war, so much more. We've even seen the dawn of civilizations, kingdoms, cities, rulers, kings, and so on. And then, of course, most importantly, we've seen the dawn of God's plan for salvation of mankind in the world. We saw that it was heralded actually only moments after the fall of mankind. God spoke his plan. He revealed his plan to save mankind as he told the serpent there's going to be enmity between you or your seed and the woman's seed, right? And we talked about how that was speaking clearly, the seed of the woman was clearly speaking of Jesus Christ to come. And God chose to bring forth this plan through a nation. We saw that, right? As it developed over the last several chapters. It started with one man, Abraham, right? God called him out of his land, the Ur of the Chaldees, and he showed him a land that he was going to show him. In fact, a land that he would never inherit. In fact, we're going to see, and when we get to Exodus, we'll see this even more clearly, that it would be a land that they would not inherit for 430 years from that time he was called. Now, again, we'll get to that when we get to it. But ultimately, we come to the end of an amazing story, the whole book of Genesis, really the story of God's sovereignty, his providence, his will being played out, right? And especially in the life of Joseph. We've seen that in the last several weeks that we've been together. In the face of sinful men, the things that men would do, his own brothers would do, how God uses evil plans, even the things that they intended, and he works it out for his purposes. So tonight we're going to look at chapter 49. We're going to spend actually most of our time in chapter 49, and we come to prophetic words, if you will, blessings from Jacob that he speaks over his 12 sons. Now, many of these words we're going to see how we're going to easily see how they were fulfilled in the history of the Jewish people. Some of them not so easily, but hopefully through them all we get to kind of understand God's sovereignty, his plan, get to understand kind of the prophetic word of God more clearly. So, Genesis chapter 49, and we'll go ahead and begin in verse 1 and 2. It says, "And Jacob called his sons and said, 'Gather together that I may tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Gather together and hear, you sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father.'" So he's calling them together, and he says at the end there, "Listen to Israel, your father." So truly, as he speaks forth these words, they're from the Lord, and this is truly coming from Israel, right? In other words, the man that God crafted and molded through trials and through the different things he went through in his life. Israel, not Jacob. So these words will, again, have immediate implications. We're going to see that. We'll see them have implications for things that will take place in the near future. In some cases, we're going to see they actually have even implications for things that would take place in the very end of man's history, talking about Revelation and the end times. So we'll start, and as he does, he starts in order of the ages of his sons. Although we'll see at a certain point he doesn't necessarily follow that all the way through. But we begin with Reuben, right? Reuben, verse 3, it says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power." So again, Reuben's a firstborn. So he starts with Reuben, and That makes sense, right? He even gives words that are very positive, right? My might and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. And I think of how people are, when they have their first child. And I guess for a dad, a father, especially if it's a son, right? It's like, oh, it's my son. The firstborn, it speaks of so much hope and potential, right? And if it's a son, it's like, oh, it can carry on the name, right? It's the firstborn to carry on my name. I know that that's secure. And yet, when we look at Reuben, and we're going to see here even in this blessing, if you want to call it, he becomes a bit of a disappointment, right? Verse 4, it says, Reuben, unstable as water, you shall not excel, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it, and he went up to my couch. So the latter half of that verse is talking about and refers back to the moment in Genesis 35 when Reuben committed incest and adultery by laying with Bilhah, which was one of Jacob's wives, right? And so that act alone will cause and has caused Reuben to forfeit his birthright as the firstborn. But even beyond that one incident, we've seen this as we moved along through the book of Genesis. Reuben has fulfilled this word that his father speaks over him. Being unstable as water. I think of rivers, right? Very seldom does a river flow just straight, perfectly straight. Almost always rivers, we call it meander, right? Actually, that word meander comes from a river in China called the Meander River, right? So that's what meander does. It meanders. Rivers just go all over. Why do they do that? Because they take the path of least resistance, right? They take the path of least resistance. And then also, we have a river here, and I know that in its history, not long ago, when the waters, rains come and the water, the river will burst its banks, right? It'll just overflow its banks. That was Reuben. That was Reuben in both of those ways. Remember when they wanted to kill Joseph? His brothers wanted to kill Joseph, and Reuben, he says, "Oh no, don't kill him. Just come on in, guys. Have a seat."
Okay.
So they wanted to kill Joseph. They wanted to kill Joseph, and so Reuben, he does step up, but he compromises, and he kind of says, "Well, don't kill him. Just throw him in this pit." Right? And so because he didn't just step up and straight ahead just say, don't do this, right? This is wrong. So he compromises, right? So he takes the path of least resistance. And it turns out obviously not well for Joseph. Then later, they had gone to Egypt. They got food. They didn't know it was Joseph, right? And then they take Simeon and they say, bring back Benjamin. So when they go back to their father and they tell him the whole story, right? Reuben just steps up and he says, well, just give me Benjamin and we'll go. And if we don't return, you can kill both my sons. It's kind of like an outburst, right? He burst, in a sense, burst his banks, right? And he just exclamation. And that exclamation, we talked about that. It didn't help any matters. It didn't help anything. It just made things worse. So Reuben fulfilled this word spoken by Israel. As well, in the future, now we get to the tribe of Reuben. Reuben would be one of the tribes that chooses to settle on the east side of the Jordan. Right? So in other words, again, path of least resistance. We don't want to go in. We'll just settle here. We don't have to worry about stuff. It's kind of a clear land and so on. As a result, of course, when they were taken captive, they would be one of the first tribes to be taken captive by the Assyrians. As well, something very interesting about the history of the nation of Israel. From the tribe of Reuben, there would come no judge within the judges during the time of the judges. Of course, there would be no king. We know that's only in Benjamin initially, and then into Judah. But there also would come no prophet from the tribe of Reuben. in Deuteronomy 33, Moses, he's blessing all of the tribes as they're going to go into the promised land. And he's kind of doing it similar to Jacob's blessings here. And so when he speaks about Reuben, Moses says, let his men be few. And if we read later accounts, when the tribe of Reuben is numbered, sure enough, he's one of the smaller of the tribes. So there's a fulfillment there. So as I said as well, Reuben, he forfeited, because of what he did, he forfeited his birthright. Now, if you think about this, and I said this before, I said the birthright went to Judah. Now, that is ultimately true, but what I didn't mention last week is that when Jacob was blessing Joseph's sons, and he crossed his arms, right, Ephraim and Manasseh, right, what was actually taking place there is he was actually passing on the birthright to Joseph and to his sons, right? So we say, well, technically, the birthright actually passed to Joseph and to Ephraim and Manasseh. So, and that's why you would say, because the one with the birthright, the oldest generally would get the birthright, they would get a double portion. And so Joseph then would get a double portion because both of his sons would receive a blessing from Israel, from Jacob. But here's what actually takes place. If you 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, it says this. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was indeed the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. But here it is. It says, yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's. And so basically what that's basically saying is that, okay, the birthright was taken from Reuben and then passed to Joseph, but ultimately we know that the promise that was made to Abraham, that through him all the nations we blessed, would come through Judah because it would come through Christ himself. So Judah ended up with that, in the real sense, the birthright. So that's Reuben. We move to the next two, and they're kind of clumped together here. So this is number 2 and 3, if you will, of Simeon and Levi. Now, verse 5 says this, Simeon and Levi are brothers. It says, instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So you think about it. You're getting blessings from your father, and then Simeon and Levi step up. Okay, we're next. And then he says this. Not much of a blessing. It's more of a cursing, if you will, right? But this all stems from, if you remember when we went through it, right? This all stems from the incident where the son of the king of Shechem basically raped Dinah, their sister. And because of that, these guys, instead of just doing the right thing, dealing with the situation, even dealing with the son of the king of Shechem, they basically deceived them, saying everything's all good, and we will let you marry our sister, and we'll marry your daughters, and so on. And all you have to do is become circumcised. Every one of your men have to do that. And so while they did it, and while they were all recovering, it tells us that Simeon and Levi go in and they wipe all the men out. And then they plunder the city, and they take all the plunder and the women and so on and so forth, right? So this was a bad thing. In fact, it tells us that Jacob was not pleased with the whole situation. And so this blessing is not a blessing, but more of a cursing. And it tells us the result of this for them would be that he says, I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Now, we're going to look at both of these guys, but I do want to add this. Remember, I think I said this before, that I believe Simeon was the worst of the two, right? Because, when we talked about Joseph as far as his brothers, remember when he had to kind of pretend that he was going to take one of them and lock him up? Which one did he pick? He picked Simeon, right? So there was a somewhat indication that Simeon was kind of the ringleader in a lot of this. That his brother Levi, who was the younger one, followed suit, sure, but it was really Simeon that was pressing the issue. He was the real kind of cruel leader, if you will. And so think about this, because when it came to divide the land, Simeon actually doesn't even get a whole territory for himself. He's actually placed within the territory of Judah. So Simeon didn't even get a whole section of land for himself. And in Deuteronomy 33, back when Moses was doing his blessings, right, Simeon isn't even mentioned. It's not even mentioned by Moses. So that's Simeon. So Simeon was, in a sense, disseminated within Judah, so it was kind of scattered there. And then Levi, okay, we know that the word for him comes to pass because, of course, we know that Levi, right? Levi becomes the tribe of Levi, which is what? The priesthood, right? And we also know that the tribe of Levi, as priests, they didn't get a territory themselves, right? So for them, they were actually dispersed within, they got cities, 48 cities to be exact. But they were all distributed and dispersed amongst all of the various territories of the different tribes. So again, a fulfillment of this blessing or this prophecy that Israel speaks. And then as well, we would also say, in addition, we see Manasseh and Ephraim become tribes, right? So if you think about it, if you added all the tribes up, we always talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, but really, if you do the math, how many tribes really are there? There's actually 13 tribes if you add Manasseh and Ephraim, right? But generally speaking, the reason why you say 12, because Levi isn't part of that, right? Because Levi belonged to God. Levi took him for himself, the priesthood for himself. As well, they didn't get territories. They were mixed in and divided in amongst all the other people. So there's an element of fulfillment there with that, with Simeon and Levi as well. So fourth, we come to Judah. A lot to be said about Judah. Verse 8 says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the people, binding his donkey to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. Of all the brothers, of all the blessings that were given, of course, you'll see here, this was the most said about any of them, was for Judah. And so Judah, of course, means praise. That's what the name means. And so that makes sense. He says, your brothers shall praise you. Now, it's interesting because it was Joseph. Remember, Joseph was the one that had the dreams that his brothers would bow down to him, right? And yet, we also said that Joseph, he served as a type of what? A type of Christ. He was a type of Christ. And so if Christ comes through the line of Judah, then it certainly makes sense that Judah would be spoken of as his brothers bowing down to him. Right? So the reason why they bow down to Joseph, because Joseph was a type of Christ. So it all points to the line of Judah. And now when you look through these phrases, and each of these phrases, we're going to break it down as we move through here, but you can see the prophetic imagery and the references through these verses. First it says, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. And of course that's fulfilled first off in David and all the lineage of David as kings. David conquered all the enemies around him and so on. But we also know that Christ conquered his enemies. At the cross, it says in Colossians 2:15, having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. Right? So he conquered spiritually, he conquered his enemies at the cross, but we also know in Revelation, at the Battle of Armageddon and in the last days, he's going to conquer those that come against him, those enemies. Amen. And so we see that as clear, that this speaks all the way to the end of time, one of those moments that we talked about. And then it talks about him being a lion, a lion's whelp. He lies down as a lion, who shall rouse him, and so on. And of course, we know that Jesus is called in Revelation 5:5 the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And then it says, a scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from his feet until Shiloh comes. A scepter is a kingship, right? It's a sign of a king. Of course, we see that fulfilled in the line of David, of the tribe of Judah, and his descendants. But then it says, until Shiloh comes, right? That term Shiloh is certainly a messianic term. The meaning of the term, or the word Shiloh, is kind of shrouded in a little bit of a mystery. Like, there's various different types of meanings that people ascribe to the word Shiloh. But it's interesting because all of those meanings actually point to the Messiah. So meanings such as the sent, like someone that's sent out, right? Or the seed, that's what some people believe Shiloh means, the seed. And then the other term that it can mean is possibly is the peaceable and prosperous one. So you can see how that all of those can point to Jesus Christ. And they all speak of a king that will rule. And in fact, it says, to him shall be the obedience of the people. And we know that it tells us that every knee will bow, every tongue will confess unto Christ. So then it goes on and says, binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. Man, that speaks clearly, right? That's a great reference. We know what that is too, right? Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. In fact, that connects right to Zechariah 9:9, the prophecy that says, behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey. But as well, it says the donkey is connected to the vine, even to the choice vine. Well, who do we know is the vine, right? Jesus said, I am the vine in John 15. Then he says, another phrase, he washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. Now that's a little more obscure, to be honest with you. But we can say, okay, well, the wine and the blood of grapes, that could speak to the blood of Christ, right? We know as far as wine, and we just said that Jesus called himself the vine. I am the vine. But here's another passage that this definitely could apply to. Isaiah 63, verses 1 through 4 says this, and this is actually speaking or prophesying of Christ's second coming, right? So here it goes. It says, who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Basra, this one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength? So ask the question, and then the answer comes, I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. And then another question says, why is your apparel red and your garments like one who treads in the winepress? Answer, I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me, for I have trodden them in my anger and trampled them in my fury. Their blood is sprinkled upon my garments. I have stained all my robes. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. So what this is speaking of is the fact that when Christ comes, he's going to come in white robes, but his robes won't be white. They'll be red, stained with the blood of those that are being judged, right? So this prophecy then that Israel is giving over his son Judah actually speaks all the way to the end of time. It speaks to the last days. And then the last part of it says, his eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. Now, another very obscure passage, verse, or whatever. I'm not really 100% sure exactly how it applies. You might say, well, the darkness of his eyes could speak of his judgment at his second coming. The teeth whiter than milk could also speak of when he does come, he's going to reveal his glory and the joy of those that are saved in his smile. So there's potentially some fulfillment in that. So that's Judah. We moved to number 5. That's Zebulun. It says, verse 13, Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. Now, it's interesting because this is that moment when Zebulun is not the fifth son in order. Zebulun is actually the 10th son. So for some reason, Jacob puts him up as right after Judah. But there is one potential significance why Zebulun is placed here. Scholars will point out that Jesus, though he was born in Judah, right, Bethlehem in Judah, he actually was raised in the territory of Zebulun. He was raised in Nazareth, which is in the territory of Zebulun. And Zebulun is also, later, the tribe of Zebulun is praised by Deborah in Judges 5:18 for their heroics, right? As well, the tribe of Zebulun was loyal to David in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 33 and verse 40. So here it speaks of Zebulun dwelling by the haven of the sea and haven for ships. The territory, again, it's in the north, kind of northwest area of Israel. It's bordered on the Mediterranean on one side, and most of the area of what we know as Galilee, right? Most of the area known as Galilee. Think about this. 11 out of the 12 apostles would come from the region of Zebulun. The term Zebulun actually means exalted, but some would say it actually has other connotations to mean go out, right? So if that's the case, then you could say, well, wow, the apostles, they kind of represent this term and this prophecy because they are not only were they from Zebulun, but they were also exalted and they were also sent out. They go out to preach the gospel around the world. So there's a sense of fulfillment in Zebulun there. Number 6 is Issachar. Verse 14 and 15 says, Issachar is a strong donkey, lying down between two burdens. He saw that rest was good and that the land was pleasant. He bowed his shoulder to bear a burden and became a band of slaves. Now, there's not a whole lot, even though there's 2 verses here, but there's not a whole lot on this particular tribe. We will say this, a donkey I know sometimes we think of a donkey as kind of like, donkeys kind of less than horses. But in their culture, a donkey was a noble creature. It was a working class creature. It was somebody that would get in there and do all the work. Of course, we know Jesus rode, we just talked about it, into Jerusalem on a donkey, right? And so they were, Issachar would be a strong tribe. We know that that's true because when you look at the numbering of how many they were, there was a lot of them. They were one of the larger tribes, Issachar. And so they were a strong donkey. But it also appears by this prophecy that though they were a strong, kind of large tribe, they also decided, you know what? We're going to take our ease. We're going to take our rest. And it tells us because of that, they would become a band of slaves. We know they're in the north as well. And of course, they went into captivity under the Assyrian assault as they attacked the northern kingdom. So that's Issachar. Number 7, we got Dan. I know I always think, well, I'm the tribe of Dan, but you know what? We're going to see. It's not a good thing to be of the tribe of Dan, to be honest with you. Verse 16, it says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels so that its rider shall fall backward. And then it says, I have awaited for your salvation, O Lord. Now, interesting, Dan is one of the more interesting tribes because, first of all, the name Dan means judge, right? And so the first line here, Dan shall judge his people, that is fulfilled because one of the judges in the book of Judges was Samson. Samson was of the tribe of Dan. But that should tell you a little bit of something about where we're going with this, right? Because Samson is a great example. He is an example of carnality and compromise, right? And so Jacob goes on and says, Dan will be a serpent, by the way, biting the heels, right? He's going to be a problem. And it's interesting when you look at how Dan is depicted and how he's referred to at various points in the history of Israel, there seems to be a reoccurring attitude against the tribe of Dan. In fact, in Joshua, the tribe of Dan, they were initially given the territory of the Philistines, right? Where the Philistines were. That was further kind of southwest, right? That was kind of that area. They decided, it's too hard. It's too difficult. So they ended up going way north and taking a territory way north that wasn't really initially meant to be theirs, right? And so they kind of bucked the system a little bit and said, you know what, we're not going to take that territory. And think about this, because they did that, because they didn't seek to drive out the Philistines were a thorn in the side of Israel all of their history, right? As well, in the tribe of Dan, in Judges chapter 18, is the very first incident of idolatry in the nation of Israel. Happened in the tribe of Dan. As well, when the kingdom split, right, and Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, when he was going to set up, wrongfully, he's going to set up these golden calves, right? He's going to set two of them up. One of them he set up, where? In the tribe of Dan, right? In fact, you can even go there today. It's called Tel Dan. And if you go to Tel Dan and you go up there, it's way north in the north of Israel, there's a giant altar. It's still there. And not the calf, that's gone, thankfully. But there's a giant altar where they had the calf on. So it's still there today. So Dan had a bad reputation. But even before Judges, even before the northern kingdom, there was a lot of things that indicated that there was some sort of a bias or some sort of an attitude against Dan. He didn't always, and there's various different listings of the tribes and so on. You look at the tribe of Dan, and he's always kind of disrespected. So when they list, these are the sons of so-and-so, the sons of so-and-so, and they give you all these names, and then they say, and then this is the sons of Dan are, and then they would say one, and they say, and then the rest are the sons of Dan. And they would just kind of diss him, right? And that happens regularly with the tribe of Dan. When the tribes would move out in the wilderness, when they would head out in the wilderness and they'd take off, they were in a certain formation. Guess who was in the last? Who was in the very end, in the back of the tribes? Obviously somebody had to be in the back, of course, but it was Dan, right? He was in the back. When Joshua distributed the territories, who was the last to be given their distribution of territories? It was Dan. Also, and this is the most noticeable one, right? So that's during the history of Israel. But in the very end of time in Revelation, when the tribes are listed and those tribes would be sealed, 144,000, 12,000 from every tribe, guess who's missing? The tribe of Dan. He's not even mentioned. He's not sealed, in other words. He's not given that seal by God that at least 12,000 of each tribe would come through the tribulation and be protected by God. So many people even believe, and this is not even just Christian scholars, but even Jewish scholars, they believe that the Antichrist will come through the tribe of Dan. They're not sure. We're not sure. But let me just say this, because you think, well, Dan, God wiped him out. He's not in Revelation. That tribe is no more, right? Well, not so fast, right? Because God didn't completely wipe them out. Look at verse 18 again. At the end of him saying all this about Dan, it says, I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. Now, I think that, that could be just Jacob speaking forth and kind of just looking for some hope in the midst of, cursing Dan, if you will, But I think it has to do with Dan, because in Ezekiel 48, even though Dan is not there, the tribe is not there in Revelation, in Ezekiel it speaks of the millennial period. So after the tribulation, you have the 1,000-year millennial period. Well, Dan, when they're distributing the land again, and they're speaking about all the various tribes, there's Dan again. There's Dan finally. And actually, he is one of the first to be given his territory. So I think that's interesting, because I think that you would say that in Christ then, there's redemption, right? There's redemption, even for someone as carnal as the tribe of Dan. That's good stuff. Number 8, Gad, verse 19. Gad, a troop shall tramp upon him, but he shall triumph at last. Now, Gad, it's interesting, is it says Gad, the word Gad means a troop. So it's kind of like a troop will trample on the troop, if you will. And of course, Gad, what do we know about Gad? They were one of the tribes, just along with Reuben and half the tribe of Manasseh. They settled outside, east of the Jordan. And of course, we know what their fate was. When they were being under attack, they were the first to go into captivity. But we do know this, that Gad ultimately will triumph. Again, we see Gad in Ezekiel 48 listed, as well as in Revelation, and he's listed there amongst the 12 tribes. So Gad ultimately will triumph. Number 9, Asher. Verse 20, it says, bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Now, Asher is actually in the very northwest of Israel. And it originally encompassed the area called Tyre or Sidon, Tyre and Sidon. Now, that may sound familiar because if you know your Bible history, when they were building the temple, and David, before Solomon was going to build the temple, David started getting all the stuff together, materials, and he needed some lumber. He also needed craftsmen and people that were gifted in craftsmanship and workmanship. Where did he go? He went to the king of Tyre, right? So, yeah, not Israel, but it's the area that belonged to Asher, and they possessed all of these resources in that area, right? The tribe. Interestingly enough, just an added side note, Anna in Luke chapter 2, remember she met Mary and Joseph with baby Jesus, and she blessed Jesus. She was from the tribe of Asher as well. So number 10, you have Naphtali, or Naphtali. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but it says Naphtali is a deer let loose. He uses beautiful words. Naphtali means wrestlings. Now, not much about Naphtali, but one interesting thing that it speaks of, and it could be a real fulfillment, at least of this first half of this verse here. In Judges chapter 4 and 5, there's a judge by the name of Barak. And Barak is of the tribe of Naphtali. And him and his armies, they go out and they defeat the army of Sisera, and that tells them that it describes them coming down like the idea of a deer let loose is that it's like it's running now, it's hauling down, just kind of running through the down the hills or down the fields. Well, that's that picture that it gives of this of Barak and his troops, right, coming against the armies of Sisera. Also, Naphtali is kind of just near the area of Galilee, and we know that Jesus himself did a lot of ministry in the area of Naphtali, so there could be a fulfillment of the fact that he uses beautiful words. Jesus spoke many of those words in that particular territory. Number 11, you get to Joseph. Now, we already talked about in last time the blessing that Jacob and Israel gave to Manasseh and Ephraim, his sons. But here he gets a specific kind of blessing for himself. Verse 22, I'll read a few of these verses. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. But his bough remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven and above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb, blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who is separated from his brothers. Now, this really, most scholars believe is most of this is really not so much a blessing for the future. It's really more of a recap or a kind of looking back at things retrospectively as far as Joseph's life, especially the first few verses. As he talks about the archers have bitterly grieved him, they shot at him and hated him. And of course, that's all the things that Joseph had to endure in his life. But then it says, but his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong. Right, so he endured. We know that because we've just read the whole story. He endured all that he had to go through, and God, strengthened him through it. In fact, it even says, "By the hands of the mighty God of Jacob, from there is the shepherd and the stone of Israel." I like that because he's basically saying God sustained him. God kept Joseph through all of those things. And what's awesome is that the term shepherd and the stone of Israel, that's the first time in the Bible that the term shepherd and the term stone is used in reference to God, to Christ, right? So that's very notable. And even the rest of it, it speaks of the fact that God used Joseph. He saved Joseph. Why? To save the rest of his family. And if you think about it, what Joseph is basically saying is that the nation of Israel owe their very existence to the faithfulness and the life of Joseph, right? And now his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, we know that, Manasseh, half the tribe was outside of the in the east of the Jordan, but even the one half tribe that was inside Israel, they didn't fare so well. And then Ephraim became a very large tribe. In fact, the northern kingdom was oftentimes referred to as Ephraim, right? But they were full of idolatry and carried away captive in the Syrian assault. So the last one is Benjamin. Verse 27, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Now that's kind of interesting because Benjamin, he was the youngest. He was the favorite, if you will, of besides Joseph, of Jacob. But if you know your history of Israel and you pay close enough attention during the time of the judges as well as during the time of the kings, you'll find that the men of Benjamin were quite ferocious in their skills as men of war. Right? They were you have various examples of this. Skilled archers, skilled soldiers. You have Ehud was one of the judges during the time of Judges. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. Of course, we know that King Saul and his son Jonathan were skilled soldiers. They were very, very skilled and kind of ferocious in war. And they were from the tribe of Benjamin. You go even beyond this. You get to the New Testament. Think about this. That includes also one Saul of Tarsus, who was also of the tribe of Benjamin. And what was he doing before he was converted? Ferociously persecuting and attacking the church, right? And you'd like to think that after he was converted, that Paul took that same ferocity and used it to preach the gospel, right? And we see that. Now, that's the 12 sons. The rest of the chapter are really Jacob's instructions before he dies for him to be buried. It says, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them, and he blessed them. He blessed each one of them according to his blessing. Then he charged them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my father in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite as a possession for a burial place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife, and there they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is there were purchased from the sons of Heth. And when Jacob had finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now that's amazing. That's kind of like dying on cue, right? He finished blessing his sons. I'm sure that probably took a lot out of him. He spoke, preaching or sharing, I should say, by the power of the Holy Spirit to share with their sons. And then at that moment when he finished, boom, he died and he passed on. So that moves us to chapter 50. Now we're going to go through chapter 50 quite rapidly, just to be honest with you. So I'm going to read about 14 verses right up front to begin with. Then it says, Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for him, for such the days required for those who were embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Now when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, behold, I am dying. In my grave which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will come back. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the house of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's house. Only their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with them both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great gathering. You can imagine, right? And this is like an entourage, right, going up. You know, people must have been like, what is going on here? Who is this being buried? And it says, then they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, and they mourned there with a great and very solemn lamentation. He observed 7 days of mourning for his father, and when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning of the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a deep mourning of the Egyptians. And they thought it was Egyptians because it was all the Egyptian kind of paraphernalia, the chariots and so on. It says, therefore its name was called Abel Mizraim, which means mourning of the Egyptians, which is beyond the Jordan. His sons did for him just as he had commanded, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as property for a burial place. And after he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who went with him to bury his father. So that's all about Jacob being taken back, and they buried him, and so on and so forth. We have just a little bit left, but I do want to say this. It's one last moment with Joseph and his brothers, and it really is ultimately a moment of doubt, a moment of kind of worry and of concern. And we're going to see this. Verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did to him. So they're obviously thinking, well, Dad's now gone, and maybe Joseph was just holding back because Dad was here. And they were like, maybe, now that he's gone, things are going to go bad. So they kind of start, pressing the situation to kind of come to Joseph, right? Verse 16, they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespass of your servants of the God of your father. And Joseph, when they spoke, says, and Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. So the idea here is that they're coming to Joseph, they're sending messages, they're saying, please forgive us. And Joseph's like, I thought we dealt with all of this. It grieved Joseph to think that his brothers still thought that he could possibly have anything against him. After all that he's done for them, after all that he said to them, right? And so I love Joseph's response. And Joseph's response, I want you to hear this, is really the summation of the whole story of Joseph. It's the summation of really the place where the children of Israel are at right now. In verse 19 it says, and Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive. Therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Think about that, right? That's the whole summation, right? The enemy means it for evil. God uses it for good.
Amen.
Right? That's the summation. We'll talk about that in a moment, but we come to these last couple of verses of the book of Genesis. And this is about Joseph's end of his life, right? So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, again, this story all speaks to really the miraculous and to the gracious sovereignty of God, right? How God can take the worst that life and mankind can throw at people and then do something that's even beyond beautiful. Do something that's even beyond, right? Now, I think about how people say, we hear people say, you know, when they see atrocities or they see something happen, like some terrible thing happen, people doing certain things to people, and they say, well, if that happens, how can there be a God? Or they say something like, well, if there is a God, how can he allow this atrocity? How can he allow this to happen? But the thing is, and I would say of that is, I say, first of all, they don't realize that whatever that atrocity was, it wasn't God. It was man, it was in his sinfulness, or it was even Satan influencing men to destroy each other, right? And yet what they also failed to do is they failed to look at the bigger picture, right? They failed to look at the bigger picture. In other words, they failed to wait and see what God actually can bring even out of all that evil, right? It reminds me of the passage in Isaiah 61 verse 3 where it says God brings beauty from ashes, right? The oil of joy for mourning, right? That's the heart of God, right? That's the nature of the gospel, right? That's the nature of the gospel, that through death God brought forth life, right? And so though we are, as sinners, though we've done everything to bring pain, we've done everything to bring suffering, sickness, death into our own lives, into the lives of others around us, right? Into this world, though we're deserving of all of God's wrath and all of his judgment, God has actually made a way for us to escape it, right? Escape that judgment through his son, through his sacrifice. And that he took all of that judgment upon himself, right? He who knew no sin became sin for us. So the truth is, and this is kind of where we wind up our time, is what we need to remember is all we need to do is turn from our sinful ways. Repent of that. Turn to the Lord, right? Turn from our sin, turn to the Lord, and receive his salvation, right? I think that's really, if you think about it, ultimately what the book of Genesis is all about. It's all about God's grace, right? The dawn, if you will, of God's love and grace for this world.